Okay, that was our 1 minute. It is now 3:01 on Thursday afternoon, which means it's time for an interagency state fiscal recovery funds meeting. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Lee Lilly in the Office of the Governor. For those who've not seen me before, glad to have you on the call. The first call of 2024 as we continue our ongoing work to make sure the state is recovering stronger and more resiliently. I want to welcome everyone. We're going to have a lot of interesting meetings this year, but this is a good one to start with because 2024 is a big year for SFRF. And our topic today is mostly going to center on obligation as we try to think about making sure we have all these funds obligated within the deadline, which is at the end of this year presently. Now, there are other factors that may influence that. We're waiting on some rules from Treasury as usual. We've got Congress, they're doing things, but for now, we're all operating under the very, very wise assumption, because it is the law, that we've got to get all obligation done here by the end of the year. And we're going to do that because the state's going to make the best use of all these federal funds. We also want to talk with you about how we're doing this effectively. Today's mostly going to be obligation, but future conversations are still going to focus on all the important implementation activities we're taking on, the monitoring we're doing. And eventually we're going to do some more talking about storytelling, so that we're making sure that our stakeholders, taxpayers, and others understand the good work that our agencies are doing to help them in their communities. But that'll come later. Today is about obligation updates, and of course our traditional office hours. So thank you for taking time to be with us. I'm going to turn it over to the experts, starting with Stephanie McGarrett. Stephanie.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, this is definitely a good start to the year. We have been going through our records with NCPRO and our discussions with you, and we just want to review that with you and make sure you know what's coming up, because we're going to have some really intensive conversations to make sure that the funds that the SFRF that you have are going to be obligated by the calendar year. And we need to know that fairly soon, as this is our last chance coming up in the short session to have funds reappropriated if we do not think that we can use them either through obligation, or if we don't think that our subrecipients are going to be able to expend them by the end of the 2026 calendar year. Unfortunately, Treasury's, even though, as Lee pointed out, we don't quite know what the final version of obligation is going to be, we did make our public comments to them in December, and they have not yet come back with a final obligation rule. We're fairly certain that they're going to give us limited flexibility to move funds around. So we need to know that we have solid plans in place to spend this money through the end of 2026, because otherwise we're going to end up forfeiting the funds. So we've got some slides to share with you. We will send them around to the agencies after this meeting. So keep that in mind. And can y'all see that, or is it not big enough? Because you can see it? Okay. I think this will be easier than trying to put it in slideshow when I can't see any of your faces anymore. So it's hard for me to tell when you have a question. So I would encourage you to ask questions along the way, and I will share what we're going to talk about. First, obligations, then expenditures and expenditure projections, which we need to do by project and subrecipient. And then the at-risk funds reallocation. We are going to report to OSBM by mid-March what we think agencies are going to be unable to spend through the end of 2026, and what they're going to be unable to obligate. And then we will leave that up to OSBM, the governor's office, and of course the legislature to determine how they want to proceed moving forward. We know that some of these funds are going to be incredibly difficult to spend within the time frame that we have provided. And then if we have any time left, we will talk about office hours. So just as a reminder, because I've already gotten this question once, there is the obligation deadline is December 31st, 2024. And the obligation definition, as you can see in that second bullet point, occurs at the state agency level when an order is placed for property and services and a state agency enters into a contract. So appropriations, unfortunately, are not a strong enough commitment to make those an obligation. They do allow some administrative costs to be incurred in 2025 and 2026, and so we can talk about those issues individually with agencies as they arise. But I think for the most part, we're still waiting more Treasury guidance on how could they expand that definition of administration. But again, this is what it requires for your funds to be obligated. You do not have to obligate funds down through the final level of subrecipients and contractors. So once you have a subaward in place, it's considered obligated. You don't have to worry about your subrecipients or contractors further obligating those funds. As we pointed out, we're still waiting for the obligation guidance from Treasury, the final version. Now, here's the concerning part. We have $5.4 billion from State Fiscal Recovery Fund, but we still have 1.56 billion that has not been obligated. So the budget for these funds was passed in November 2021 for the vast majority of these funds. We're about at the 75% mark, a little bit past the 75% mark, at which point we have to obligate them. And you can see that we have 61 projects that, which are largely based on the appropriation, but 61 projects that we've reported to Treasury, and the funds are fully obligated. We have 27 that are pretty much on track. They have 75 to 100% of their funds obligated. And then we have 64 projects that need to have that have fewer than 75% of their funds obligated, and that together it's about $1.5 billion. I just need to point this out to you in case you missed it in Treasury's guidance. If those funds are obligated by the end of this year, we will be repaying them to Treasury come January of next year. And I do not want us or you to be in a situation where you're answering hard questions from the legislature, because in case you're not aware, the legislature has made estimates of how much money we will earn in interest from these funds over the next few years. So if we haven't obligated the money and we pay $1.6 billion back to the U.S. Treasury, that is going to be $1.6 billion upon which we don't earn interest. And that the legislature has appropriated that money. So will be some hard questions to be asked about why we failed to get that done. So we are going to be having follow-up conversations with you between now and the middle of March to understand and help you obligate these funds. And if you can't obligate these funds, we just need to know about it. We're running out of time, and because of the way the legislative cycle works and because of Treasury's current guidance, which we expect to stay as is, we need to move on this issue. So in terms of expenditures, we're also going to ask you to project expenditures through the end of 2026 for this reason. Treasury's obligation rules that we covered in our December and November meetings lock agencies and their subrecipients into their reported projects, regardless of the revenue replacement designation. So we had to go to Treasury and we report to them quarterly. Our next report's due in 6 days. And we have to tell them how we're spending the money, including the money that's designated as revenue replacement. We're not allowed to move that money around once the end of 2024 comes. So we need to know, are you going to be able to not only obligate it, but are you going to be able to expend it? And with expenditures, it does have to happen all the way through to the end. So subrecipients, contracts, they have to be fully paid out and expended by the end of 2026. So we're going to ask you to do some projections so that you know, or you have a good idea of how much money you're going to be able to spend through the end of 2026. Again, any money that's not spent through the end of 2026, we forfeit it. And you have to know you're not going to be able to move the money around. So we really have to have good, solid plans in place this year and early in this year, because if we don't, then we need to let the legislature know, and the governor, first the governor, then the legislature know, so that the money can be reappropriated. So how are we going to get to this point? We are going to make sure that your grants managers meet with every agency on each project, and we're going to do this by March 7th. We want to make sure, again, that the obligation deadlines can be met and that the expenditure deadlines can be met. We need you to be prepared to share detailed plans for your projects down to the subrecipient level, and make projections of expenditures by the end of calendar year. I understand that some of you have gotten appropriations that by now, 2 years after the appropriations were made, it's become clear that you're probably not going to be able to expend them through the end of 2026. It'll either take you more time or the conditions have changed. And so we're at the point where we need to report those funds so that they can be moved to something that we can spend by the end of 2026. And so we're going to put those into the categories of at risk. So those projects that are at risk of being able to be expended by the end of 2026, and those that we know we can spend through the end of 2026. Some of these are probably going to be tough projects. We've had some earmarks that were made, not to pick on DEQ, but because it's just what the cards they were dealt. But DEQ got some earmarked projects where appropriations were made to towns that may not have had fully developed water and sewer plans, infrastructure plans in place. And so I think those projects may have a really hard time meeting the deadline where they can fully expend their funds by the end of 2026. It's certainly not DEQ's fault. It's not the local government's fault. It's just the condition that we're in. So we just need to be able to report that those are at risk. And then we'll let the governor and his budget determine how he wants to handle that possibility. And then the legislature can obviously determine in their own budget how they want to handle and what level of risk they're willing to assume in terms of potentially not being able to complete these projects. There is always the chance that Congress could extend the deadline, but it's definitely beyond Treasury's control and most definitely a congressional decision. So I think it's in our best interest to let the governor and the legislature know what we know we can do for sure and where we have some questions about whether or not these funds could be expended in later years. So we are trying to pull all of that together. We're meeting with the CFOs tomorrow at part of their CFO meeting, and then Lee and Kristen Walker, the state budget director, will talk with cabinet secretaries on Monday. We'll also let other agency heads for the Council of State Agencies and the education systems know as well that this is the approach that we're taking, and this is what we need to be prepared to do. And then we'll report those at-risk funds by mid-March so that decisions can be made about how we want to handle them going forward. So you can see when we get to expenditures, there's even fewer funds ready or that we think will be expended in time. So to date, we've spent, we've had 78 projects that are on track, and we're counting on track as we're about halfway through the expenditure period, and they've spent at least 50% of their funds. They still, within those 78 projects, have 174 million they need to spend. There are projects that have between 25% and 50% of their funds expended, and they have about 152 million that needs to be expended. And then there are 55 projects that have fewer than 25% of their funds expended. A lot of that money is our infrastructure projects with our local governments through water and sewer, and then with our broadband with DIT. And so we know that those construction projects take a little bit more time. But even if you pull those construction projects out, there are still 50 projects with $1.1 billion at risk of not being expended by the end of the 2026 timeframe. So this is really where we're going to need y'all to make sure you have plans in place, know what those plans are and how likely you are and what amount of money you can expend, project that you can expend by calendar year, the end of 2024, 2025, 2026. And if you can't expend it by then, what amount of money do you think may need to be sent back for reappropriation to a project that we can expend it in time, or at least we're letting the legislature, the governor know so that they know that those funds are at risk. So this is going to probably be a heavy lift on some projects. For other projects, I think agencies are pretty well aware of if they have a problem spending. But we need to get some definitive information so that we can get ready in time for the short session of the legislature and for the budget process. I am happy to answer any questions, so please ask them. And Lee is happy to answer the questions as well.
Of course, I have a question, Stephanie.
I'm always glad that you do, Daryl, because you kick us off and then nobody's worried about asking a question after you ask. So great.
Yeah, we of course have our funds obligated. They've been contracted. I know you use the term subrecipient, but I take it that that's also referencing our beneficiaries relative to the grant program. Am I correct?
It is. So, for a lot of our grants out of OSBM, if you've given money to the beneficiaries, once you send the money to them, it's considered obligated and expended. So we're actually not even counting the beneficiary projects, at least for OSBM. We are for the agencies in these amounts that we presented to you. I do think that even within agencies, though, we do have some projects where agencies are doing projects, and we don't have detailed information on spending plans that we know we got this amount of money for receipts replacement, like 13 million, and we're 2 years in at this point, 50% of the way there, and we've only spent 5% of the money. So that kind of sends a strong signal to me that we don't think we're going to be able to replace all the receipts. So if that's the case, then we just need to talk about what else. We need to know that that's not going to work. That kind of raises a red flag, and then let us know what your plans are to spend them. So even if it's agency money where you're not giving it to a subrecipient or you're not giving it to a contractor, but you're using it for an agency project, we need to get a clear idea in place of how you're going to spend the money and that you're going to be able to spend it by the end of 2026. If you're not, it's not necessarily a penalty now. We just need to know about it so that we can let OSBM and the governor's office know so they can figure out if there's any sort of way they can move appropriations around so that maybe we use general funds for the later years. We try to put expenditures that we know we can make before 2026 into SFRF. So I think some agencies may have had projects 2 years ago that looked like, oh yeah, we're going to be able to do these. We're going to be able to get these done. And now, in 2024, it's for whatever various reason, it looks like it's going to be harder for them to commit those funds.
So with us, not necessarily in light of who we are and what we do and the monies we've distributed, 7 million with administrative aspects still sitting, because that's the money there. The two questions I have are tied to administrative costs, where we still have administrative money that we may not use, so we can reallocate that, I imagine, this year, and it be obligated as a result. But then also there is interest relative to our particular constituency, our particular, more specifically, our science museums that receive this money. There is an interest on their part to say, well, if there's going to be a reappropriation, is it possible for us to get more that we certainly could spend by contracting it, obligating it through contracting it by the end of this year? And so would it make sense for that to be a consideration via our program?
I think I think when you know that there are subrecipients or beneficiaries or even other parts of your program that you could use these funds for, when you report that you're not going to be able to use them for the purpose for which they've been appropriated, but you could shift them to another purpose, then I think you need to let us know that as part of that conversation. We'll share it with big OSBM and the governor's office so the governor can work through the process that they work through in their budget. Sometimes things will probably have to be reappropriated. Sometimes, depending on the legislative language and the appropriation, we may have flexibility to move it around. But that's a conversation that the agencies are going to have with OSBM and the governor's office. You can start by telling NCPRO about it so we can note it in the budget. I think there's definitely some anxiety given that the obligation deadline has not moved, that even if the money does get moved into different projects, it gets moved into projects that can be obligated within this calendar year, because Treasury will make us repay any amount of money that is not obligated by the end of this calendar year. And Lee may have other comments he wants to make in that regard.
Thank you.
Not a lot more. And first, Daryl, thanks always for kicking us off with questions. You make it easier for everybody else to ask questions too. Not a lot more to add other than to say the governor's initiated budget development processes. You all probably know that already, and this is a pretty important consideration for the budget team as we go through it to ensure that anything we really don't think we're going to get obligated and spent in time, we're able to at least advise the General Assembly, and they can potentially take action to swap funds or look at other alternatives if it's just not viable based upon our collective wisdom. And I'll just say the last thing on sort of the congressional side of this, just nothing can be assumed about Congress these days. There is draft legislation in the Senate that would push back the obligation date to 2025. But at present, Congress cannot seem to get its act together just to do the basics of budgeting and appropriation, let alone take on nuanced issues like dealing with SFRF. So I think we have to operate under the current statute and rules and make our plans accordingly. And I say this as someone who used to work in Congress, so I'm not just dinging DC in general. They're having a hard time.
So Greer, let me see if I understand. You said to help us prepare, how will your closeout process affect our expenditure deadline? I think that's a good question. Our closeout process is ready, and honestly, if you're closed out, part of the closeout process, first of all, that means you've already obligated your funds, you've already spent everything you're going to spend, and you know what amount of money you're going to return. So for a couple of programs, I don't think DOR minds me using them as an example. They had the business recovery grant program. That money by statute had to be out by a certain period of time, so they're pretty much done. And they're just they now know how much money they're going to be sending us back. They may have a couple of other businesses send some checks back, and we have to go through the sheets process, but for the most part, they're pretty clear on that. So they'll close out their program or a couple of their projects and let us know. So closeout kind of helps you get past, this is your final documentation. This is what you've returned. So I think that will, if you're closing it out, you've already, especially at this point in time, you're done. You already know what you spent, what you've obligated, and what you can spend and can't obligate. This process is really more geared towards the folks that are still in the middle of trying to figure out how feasible it is to get this implemented based on their appropriation.
That's really helpful, Stephanie. Thank you for saying that. I was just wondering that this question, the reason I asked is because we have several projects, probably similar to, is part of that construction piece, where we know that they're running close to December 2026, but some of them are going to be ending like in September 2026. But I was just wondering, depending on when you need us to close out our projects with you, like if you needed to, I think our grants manager mentioned that you might be required to close out with Treasury 30 days after December 2026, which would mean that, yeah.
So so first of all, Treasury keeps changing the rules on this all the time, but we're now into like the third or fourth grants program with Treasury that we're managing from a recovery standpoint. You usually get 90 days. And expenditures can count all the way up to the end of December 31st. So your subrecipients on your construction projects, as long as the costs are incurred before December 31st or by December 31st, 2026, you can actually pay them after December 30. You usually have 90 days. And sometimes they'll extend it depending on how it's going. So as long as, again, the cost is incurred by December 31st, you don't have to close out your project.
Oh, that's really helpful. I think I must have misunderstood what our grants manager was saying. So yeah, thank you for clarifying that.
No problem. And again, for this process where we're trying to estimate and project where we think expenditures are going to be, it's okay to say that you think some of your expenditures are going to go beyond 2026. We need to know that now, so we give the governor and the legislature a chance to decide how they might want to address it. I mean, lots of these things are beyond our control. Supply chain not operating the way you expect they would, getting the labor that you need to finish your project. I mean, we all know anytime you do construction, things can go wrong. So that we're trying to figure out, like, what is the chance things may go wrong here too. But yes, you do have until the very end of December 31st, 2026 to incur the cost. And you'll have some time to close out.
I really appreciate what NCPRO is doing to help us try and navigate this. It's really, really good to have these sessions. So just thank you for letting me ask that. That was awesome.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. We'll keep going. I feel like we're constantly giving y'all bad news, which we're really not trying to do. We just know that, when you're dealing with multiple entities here, you're trying to make sure everybody's coordinated and know what's going on. Okay, I see we have another hand up, but I don't have my people up, so I'm going to say, Jerry, go ahead.
Yes, I'm Jerry Howerton with Division of Parks and Recreation, Chief of Construction. And I had the same question along the guidelines of December 2026. Is that paid out or finished? So that was and you sort of answered that question. But I do have another question. We have several projects. We're in design. We're moving forward. We really hope to have all of those in construction documents by the end of this year. My question is, when we typically do construction projects through State Construction Office, we can't complete a project exactly for what it cost. And I'll give an example. If we get in, the project starts after January, we need a change order. Typically, following the state construction guidelines, we're required to hold a contingency, but I don't know how can we commit that, or what happens in our construction projects after, or when they start after January 1, 2025, and we need to do a change order, but we've only committed the money that's based on the construction contract itself, because there's always change orders that will have to be completed for unhidden damages or, additional cost. I'm just curious, how do we cover those costs, or how do we justify those costs?
You can't. That's the problem with the way Treasury has set this up. We have to obligate the funds, and we have to know what they're going to cost by the end of this year. And they're not going to let us move anything around. They have some really strict rules about what they will and will not allow you to do with obligation. And unfortunately, change orders are not one of the things that they're going to let you move around. We are trying very hard, just so you know, to get them to give us some flexibility on this for construction projects, because yes, our state parks are one of the people that have this concern. DEQ has about 900 local governments that are doing water and sewer projects, which have the same challenges that you're discussing here. And so we've asked, and we had to turn in questions to Treasury on December 14th, but we have not yet gotten any more information from them. But right now, you're not allowed to make changes. So what we're going to have to do in the case with state parks is we're going to have to sit down with your grants manager, and we're going to have to figure out what we do. We might have to talk to Big OSBM and figure out can you match general fund money to SFRF to address those issues.
Well, great. That answers my question. It's just, we're going to have change orders. There's going to be hidden stuff. There's going to be stuff that they're going to be additional costs. And I was just wanting to throw that out there to see how do we, where does that money come from? Or does how do we identify, because we can't just stop the project if there's a $50,000 change order that would kill the project and it's a $2 million project. It's just something we need to think about. So
yeah, and we can talk offline to kind of figure out how we handle it in that particular case. I think it might be slightly easier for state parks than say for DEQ, because you're dealing with your project and we're the prime recipient as opposed to a subrecipient. Of course, it might be harder. We just need to look at the Treasury rules and get into the specific situations that you have and talk through that. So,
and I also think that raises an issue, and I'm not sure, I don't want to speak for state construction, but typically they require us to hold a contingency. I'm not sure they're going to authorize an award of a contract without a contingency, and we'll need to at least get some insight on how to move through that also.
Right, because if you put a contingency in place and then you don't expend it, then we're going to forfeit that money at the end. So yeah, we need to talk to state construction. We need to think through it. I think at least we've worked with DOA and other agencies on other issues around contracting and purchasing, and Treasury makes you follow the state rules that you have in place. But I think there are ways that maybe we fund the contingency out of general fund, and maybe I don't know. We'd have to figure it out. We're going to have to, this is where your grants manager is really helpful to work through the specific issues, because, and with the way the funds are appropriated, everybody has a different issue, and sometimes it applies across one agency to another or one project to another, and sometimes it doesn't. So,
Well, great. Thank you. That at least gave me the answer I was looking for.
but we will help you. We will do
Okay.
everything in our power and everything within federal guidance to help you make this work. We just might have to get really creative in some areas.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Stephanie, we've got a question in the chat from Eric about if there's a mechanism for projects that were underfunded to make a case for additional funds, with a couple thumbs up from other listeners. So
Yeah, we'll come up with a formal way to do that, but I would say as part of your, I need to talk to Kristen Walker about it to make sure that it's consolidated into the OSBM budget process. I think generally, here's my philosophy that I take about these things. You tell us what you can spend and what you can't spend, and then what other needs you may have. And then I defer usually to OSBM, who has the very broad view of all the funds that are available, when they need to be spent, and what they can be used on. So NCPRO very much deals with the federal and the pandemic stuff. OSBM Maine has a much broader view of availability. So I find that they're usually more knowledgeable and know how to which pot of money would work the best for things. So I think it's fine to tell us, and let me find out from OSBM if they would rather have that be a special section of the budget requests you have. Like, could you have a special SFRF section or not? She and I just started talking today about how we're going to do this, and so I think we just need to we need to get a little bit more guidance. So it's part of the budget process together.
yeah, I know you've got ABC lists that are due here in early February, so we'll get you an answer on that really quickly. We got another hand up. Before I go there, I'll just note, since we're talking about the Treasury rules, just got an email literally right now from U.S. Treasury asking for follow-up on our concerns about obligation. So we'll schedule that meeting as soon as possible. we got some
have
we got some
many.
good feedback for them. Yeah.
I feel like we've already answered some of those last week through NASBO too. Okay.
We can answer it again.
Excellent. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, kind of going along with Jerry a little bit, but I've got several projects right now that we have requested R&R funding but did not receive. And the aspect being is that I've got or a handful of projects I could use a bunch more money for, but I would need to know almost immediately to be able to make sure that I can get those projects to a point where the money's obligated by the end of the year. I wouldn't be able to wait till, let's say, March or April. I need to know almost immediately. Is there a way that we can figure that out, or do I just need to proceed that I'm not going to get that, wouldn't be able to get the access to that money?
I think that the answer to that depends on how much flexibility you have and how the money was appropriated for your specific project. So it's hard for me without specifics to answer that. We'd have to go back. Go ahead, Lee.
I was gonna say, maybe James, we can do a one-on-one with you here shortly to kind of get a better understanding of what that is. And if it's talking about reappropriated SFRF, I don't know that there's a way to get that answer until the General Assembly's done, which is going to be a while. But there may be other options here.
Okay.
Yeah, in some of the appropriations that are SFRF projects, there's some flexibility in how we've defined how you're going to use it, but there's a little flexibility. But to Lee's point, yeah, if we have to get it reappropriated, it's going to be hard for us to move up the timeline. But I say give us the specifics, and then we'll see what we can figure out.
Should I route that through Steve as our person, or somebody else higher up?
Probably go through Steve as your person, and we'll see what we can. We'll see how we can work together to get an answer on it. It might be NCPRO, it might be OSBM. We'll have to figure it out. Any other questions? Okay, we will share these slides with you via email. Josh will send those out. And then we will also, again, CFOs, you can expect to hear more of the same tomorrow when Tommy comes to talk to the CFO meeting. And then again, we'll share this information with agency heads early next week. Thank you. And if you have questions for us for office hours, we will stay on the line.
Thanks everybody for being on today and for good questions. Of course, anything else that you think of after this meeting, don't hesitate to reach out to your grants manager or any of us on the call. I'm happy to try and get answers.
Thank you.
Thank you.